And on that front, if you reflect back to a couple of years ago, Brexit was very much the dominant headline that was sort of dominating the sort of national conversation. And it's strange actually to think just how quickly things changed when COVID arrived. But it's arguable that we're only just starting to see some of the true impact of Brexit, with staff shortages in several sectors in the economy. Now, I'm one of those people that does do a little bit of remote working from another jurisdiction. And I came back from my last trip to Spain, and I was coming back in a cab, and then saw these big long lines of people trying to queue to get petrol at the petrol stations. And I thought, well, this wasn't the case in Spain. There was no queues there. And I think that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how we might see Brexit impacting the labour market here. Now, if I could just sort of go to the first slide. So just as a reminder, we've got the Brexit timeline here. Although we left the EU back in January of last year, because of the transition period that immediately followed, an 11-month period, which extended the legacy free movement provisions, the new post-Brexit travel arrangements have actually only been in place since the beginning of this year. So from the 1st of January of this year, free movement ended, and EU nationals coming here for the first time became subject to UK immigration control. At the same time, British nationals lost that automatic right to live and work in the EU and became third country nationals or foreign nationals and subject to the local immigration requirements in each EU jurisdiction. Now, the full impact of these changes was undoubtedly cushioned by the restrictions that were imposed as a result of the pandemic. So with cross-border travel being severely restricted, and as other countries like the UK went into lockdown and either prohibited travel altogether or imposed quite strict testing and/or quarantine requirements. So that had a big impact. And if you look at the combined impact of those restrictions, you can see that in the ONS statistics, which essentially show that passenger arrivals fell by a massive 98.3% in February 2020, from 6,804,000 and a bit to 112,300. So that is obviously a significant drop in numbers. And so it's arguably, given that these restrictions have been in place for some time, and obviously we had additional lockdowns throughout the rest of the remainder of the year, that we haven't yet seen the full impact of Brexit and haven't had an opportunity to fully road test the new travel rules. So let's just take a look at what those rules are. So you can enter the UK, or EU nationals can enter the UK under our standard visitor category. Now, it's a little more straightforward for EU nationals than British nationals, because EU nationals only have to navigate the rules in the UK, whereas British nationals going to the EU have to navigate the rules in all of the different member states. Now, under the rules, because of the trade and cooperation agreement that was agreed between the UK and the EU, EU nationals can travel to the UK visa-free under our standard visitor category. Now, they can enter for up to 6 months on each trip, but the length of stay should be in line with their business purpose. So, for example, if you've got someone coming in to attend a conference, an immigration officer would be concerned if that person said, well, I'm coming in for 6 months. That's not in line with their stated intention. So although you can technically come in for 6 months, EU nationals do have to be conscious of the fact, and in fact any non-UK, non-Irish nationals have to be conscious of the fact that your visit should be in line with your stated intention. Now, it's also worth noting that EU nationals can use the e-gates to enter the UK. So in most cases, they won't actually need to see an immigration officer. They can come in with relative ease. But the downside to that is that because they don't see an immigration officer, they don't necessarily have someone to manage their expectations in terms of what is permitted under the visitor category and what isn't. So EU nationals who are coming here on a frequent basis, who were coming here on a frequent basis pre-Brexit, may be unaware of what the new regime is, particularly as they don't have to go before an immigration officer. So I think in terms of your businesses, it would be worthwhile spending some time managing those expectations and helping your employees to understand what the new framework is. And I was interested to hear Helene from Allen & Overy talk about how it was about educating their employees about the rules and what the limitations are in terms of the regulatory requirements, the tax requirements, etc. So I think that is an important exercise that businesses do need to undertake. Now, if we can just look at what is actually, though, permitted when you come in as a visitor, you can see that there is quite a broad range of activities that are permitted, from attending interviews and meetings and conferences through to negotiating and signing deals, and also carrying out site visits and work-related training. So it's actually a very broad scope of activities that are permitted. In this age of remote working, the guidance does also confirm that you can undertake activities relating to your employment overseas. So you can respond to emails or answer phone calls. The difficulty is that if you have someone, and I think one of the examples that was raised, if you have someone coming in on a leisure trip and then wanting to work a few days either side, is how do you then judge when it becomes work and when it breaches these requirements? If someone is spending a week, or if they want to spend a month, or whatever, what is the period that they can work in the UK or undertake these types of activities without then breaching the work permit rules? And so that's a very grey area of the law. But if we look at the sort of position for British nationals then, I think it's even more complex for them. So British nationals can enter the EU without a visa, again, because of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and they can enter the Schengen area, which is 26 countries, mostly EU countries, for up to 90 days in any 180-day period. Now, that total includes travel to all of the countries in the Schengen zone. So if you have someone who is coming here, traveling frequently on business, and they say travel to France for 1 week, then Germany to another, that it's important just to bear in mind that that 90-day total includes all of your travel to any country in the Schengen area. So frequent travelers are at a big disadvantage in relation to that. And I did have one rather concerned client give me a call at one point and travels frequently on business and uses up most of their 90-day limit in relation to business travel. But the thing to bear in mind is that you also have to include your leisure travel. And so her big issue was, well, how is all of my business travel going to impact my trip to Spain or my trip to other sunnier climes than the UK? And the fact is that you do need to take that into account. So again, another interesting point that came out of the previous session was that some companies have a tracker for considering how much time, or looking at how much time they've spent overseas on business trips. But most of those trackers are only good as the data that you put into them. And in fact, if you don't necessarily always include personal trips and leisure travel as part of that tracking system. So it's very important to make sure that you're looking at both of those pieces. And then in terms of the other requirements, obviously, the other big factor is that in relation to business travel, it's that you can no longer look at the immigration requirements in isolation. You do also have to look at what the COVID restrictions are and what the testing and quarantine requirements are in place. But EU nationals can essentially undertake the same type of activities that British nationals can undertake the same type of activities that EU nationals can undertake in the UK. In fact, the UK rules are a bit more generous than those for British nationals going to the EU, and substantially generous in the amount of time you could spend. So if an EU national comes to the UK, they can spend up to 6 months here, whereas if you look obviously at the EU rules, it's limited just to 90 days. And then the same caveats that you can't take up employment in the EU. And so many of us will have been used to just traveling to our local office in a particular EU jurisdiction and just working there and basing yourself out of there. But that's no longer possible under these revised rules. So I think that sort of covers off the sort of issues in relation to business travel for UK nationals going to the EU and also for EU nationals coming to the UK. One of the other big issues of the day has, of course, been COVID and the restrictions on travel that have been imposed as a result of that. And obviously, travel by EU nationals and UK nationals to the US has been restricted for some time, in fact, since March of last year. So that has just reopened, and so travel to the US has just reopened, subject to the UK nationals or EU nationals being fully vaccinated. Now, there are a list of approved vaccines, and there are some limited exemptions from that requirement. So children under the age of 18, and also if you've got if it would be harmful to your health to have a vaccination, there are certain circumstances where that would be the case, then you might be qualified for an exemption. But all of the exemptions are subject to a condition that the traveller will get fully vaccinated once they get to the US and once they've been there for 60 days. There are exemptions from the exemption in relation to getting vaccinated, and it's quite complicated. It is possible to also request a national interest exemption from these requirements, which would allow you to travel even if you're not vaccinated. But that is a process that you need to apply for that request, and you can't obviously automatically travel there. And of course, you still need to meet the pre-departure COVID test requirement and have a valid ESTA in place. So that's the position in terms of traveling to the US. I should add that obviously we've seen with the new Omicron strain of the virus, a lot of countries imposing further restrictions on travel, particularly from South Africa and the neighboring countries. That is the case with the US. They've also placed restrictions on South African nationals and people coming from those neighboring countries. But at the moment, there is no intention to extend that to other countries. But obviously, it's a changing picture in relation to that, and so potentially we could see further restrictions being imposed. So I think that just then leads to the sort of final issue, which I think it's important just to bear in mind, to flag, that the EU is intending to introduce a new European Travel Information and Authorization System, which is the EU equivalent of the ESTA scheme. Now, that is essentially to check the security status of individuals, and will be an online process very similar to the US ESTA scheme. And it will apply to all non-EU nationals who don't currently require a visa to travel to the Schengen area. So obviously that would include British nationals as well. Now, the scheme is due to be introduced across the Schengen area, but in a phased approach. So you'll not necessarily going to be sort of introduced fully until the beginning of 2023. But nevertheless, there is a process, a requirement that will be introduced gradually over the coming year. And the approval will be valid for a 3-year period, and it's just a nominal fee for applying. So like the ESTA scheme, I think it's something like €7 to apply. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind that potentially we might see ETIAS being expanded, broadened in scope to maybe include COVID requirements. So that could be potentially introduced. But the employers will obviously need to just make sure that, that their employees are applying for an ETIAS in advance of their travel, and it's recommended that you apply for that up to 72 hours before your departure. So I think those are the main sort of issues on the immigration front at the moment. I haven't at all touched upon the work permit requirements under the new post-Brexit system. That's another kettle of fish altogether. But hopefully this gives you a flavour of the issues in terms of business travel at the moment.
Thank you, Tony. That was a fantastic presentation, really helpful, and I think opened our eyes to a lot of things that people perhaps hadn't even considered as yet. So just a few questions for you, if you don't mind. And just before we get to that, I would just like to be one of the people that says, who thinks bring back Brexit once COVID started? Because I think the one thing we all thought was it couldn't get worse than Brexit, and then COVID turned up just to make us all think differently. So in terms of Omicron and COVID, how do you see the immigration regulation landscape changing? Do you think that will extend out the process in terms of applications, etc.? Or do you think it's just a flash in the pan, it will all go away very quickly?
Well, I think it's certainly not a flash in the pan. We have already seen a direct impact of COVID, obviously, in terms of the restrictions that were imposed upon travel. And obviously those are going to flex over time according to the virus and how severe it is. But I think we also see an indirect impact upon the immigration process. So with various lockdowns in countries, you see that the visa application centres have been closed in a number of jurisdictions, sometimes for quite a lengthy period of time. And obviously, if you can't get your visa application processed, you can't have your biometric details captured, you can't move forward with your visa process. So that's an important factor to consider. Most visa centres have now reopened, but you do see them still being closed in certain jurisdictions as the virus develops. And then outside of the visa application centres themselves, there is also a requirement under some of the visa categories. So for example, if you're coming here on a skilled worker visa, you need to meet an English language requirement. And so again, you may need to undertake an English language test, and a lot of the test centres have been closed. And this is particularly important, in fact, in relation to EU nationals, because although most EU nationals have perfect English language skills, they weren't necessarily taught wholly in English. And where they don't have a degree that was taught wholly in English, they need to show that they've got an English language qualification. And so if they need to take that test, and the centres in Europe have been closed in some countries for quite a long period of time, that can again hold up the whole process.
Thank you. Another question would be, when does a work trip really become a work permit issue? How grey is that area, and who is really checking?
Yes, good question, and it's a very grey area of the law. I think, as I've sort of tried to sort of take a deeper dive in relation to what you can and can't do whilst you're here as a visitor, you do need to be conscious of what you intend to do whilst you're here, and to look at those proposed activities. But also you need to consider how long you're coming here for as well, or where you're traveling to and for how long, because the amount of time you're spending in that country and what you're planning to do are the important factors to consider. And unfortunately, there's no template answer to this. You have to look at the requirements in each jurisdiction that you're going to, and the answer will be different in each jurisdiction. But I think it's worth mentioning that there can be quite severe penalties for breaching those rules. So if you're entering under a visitor visa or as a visitor, and you are then found to be undertaking activities that go beyond the scope of what is permitted as a visitor, you could, for example, in relation to the UK, be served with a ban, a re-entry ban for up to 10 years. Now that's a significant restriction on your ability to travel. So I think it's very important, and it does need to be conveyed to employees who are traveling frequently on business, what the limitations are in terms of their activities, how long they can spend in that particular country, and probably worthwhile just mentioning what those penalties are, because it does have an impact upon them personally as well.
Thank you, Tony. Just in terms of the ETIAS system, which I think is news to many of us in the room in terms of that, I know the rollout is scheduled to begin in January 2022, but do we think that will be delayed because of the new COVID variant? Do we think that that will be standardised? What do we think will be the time frame, and who's going to be the first country to pick that up?
It's difficult to say. It has already effectively been delayed until 2023. But various countries, each country is responsible for implementing it under its own rules. And so I was just speaking to a colleague of mine in Madrid yesterday about it, and effectively all of her team really haven't been sort of had to deal with it, or haven't really received any official guidance on the scheme as yet. It is a process that's underway, though, and so we will definitely see this new system being implemented by the beginning of 2023.
Thank you. And in terms of the centralised place to check your Schengen stays, what's the best route for that? Is it better that you go through your TMC? Is there a centralised place you could look on, say, an EU website where you could find out, actually, how many days have I been out of the UK and been in the Schengen area? And, you know, how is that actually being monitored? Is there somebody really checking those 90 days or not?
Wouldn't that be amazing if there's some central place that you could actually check this? There are various ways you can do it, and obviously your travel provider may keep that. Sometimes people refer to their records with airlines where they've got frequent flyer status, but there's no central real place that you can obtain it, and certainly no official place that you can obtain your Schengen record of entries and exits. Under the Schengen information system, all countries share their information. They will have a record of how much time you spent in the UK. So it is important, really, the obligation rests with the individual to make sure that they're monitoring the amount of time that they're spending in the Schengen zone. And that's important, obviously, from the perspective of complying with those rules, but also if you're found to be trying to enter the Schengen area for longer than is permitted, you could be refused entry. So you could be on that vital, critical business trip and find that you're refused entry into the Schengen area. So it is really important to make sure that you are monitoring that. And as I said before, important to make sure that you're also including your leisure travel in that equation.
Absolutely. So in terms of vaccines and immigration, at the moment they're quite separate systems. Do you foresee that they will at some point become more married up? Or do you foresee that it will remain a separate kind of two processes to deal with?
It's an interesting question. As I said before, and when I was sort of discussing the ETIAS scheme that the EU is about to introduce, I think there might be an opportunity for tying up aspects of COVID compliance with the wider security requirements, because these are essentially things that impact national security. So potentially we might see that, but at the moment the COVID requirement is being dealt with separately. In the EU they have an EU COVID pass, and obviously in the UK we also have the NHS app which you can confirm your status. Each country is sort of approaching this in its own way, and we'll really just have to see whether or not countries take an opportunity to combine the two requirements into one sort of central portal where that information could be checked.
That would be great, wouldn't it?
Yes, I don't know if any of you have travelled recently, but scrambling to show your COVID pass and then the test that you've undertaken and provide your travel documentation at the same time can be a bit of a nightmare. And so yes, it would be great to have all of that in one place.
Thank you. Just one last question from me. Obviously, it's much easier for an EU person to come into the UK than the other way round, it seems. Do we foresee any reforms in that area, or do we think that the governments are just going to see how it goes for the next few years?
So yes, I don't foresee any relaxation of the rules in relation to British nationals travelling to the EU. British nationals are obviously third country nationals and are treated like all foreign nationals when entering the EU. So that's unfortunately the situation. The EU would be very reluctant to introduce separate rules for British nationals. Obviously, I did mention the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So there is provision in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement for certain activities to be undertaken which go beyond the normal rules permitted in each EU jurisdiction. So there are provisions for contractual service suppliers, independent professionals going to the EU, which aren't necessarily contained in the normal rules, but each country applies these rules individually. So unfortunately, it is going to be a much more complex situation when you're sending a British national to undertake a business trip or to undertake a work assignment in the EU at the moment.
Perfect, thank you. Just opening up to the floor, does anybody have any burning questions? I can see one over, well, two over there.
Hi, I'm just wondering, when we're talking about the responsibility, if there were fines or etc., is it clear where that line is drawn between the individual and the company, especially as, you know, it includes leisure travel? Because there's one thing saying, you know, as a company, you have sent somebody, you know, over their days to a Schengen company, but what happens there, because it's got leisure also in the mix, if somebody hasn't declared correctly, etc., to their company that they have travelled on leisure into the Schengen zone, and then we take them over, if there was any financial, where does that responsibility lie? Have they been very clear on that for a company?
I think ultimate responsibility rests with the individual here. So it is the individual's responsibility to keep track of the amount of time that they're spending in a particular jurisdiction, in this case the Schengen area. It is difficult because we're talking about travel to a number of countries. And it's difficult, as I said, because you're also including that leisure travel piece as well. And so I think whilst many companies have got systems for tracking business trips, that's never going to be a complete picture. And so because of that, the responsibility must rest with the individual. And that's the approach that the immigration authorities will take. At the end of the day, if you've got an employee going into to Germany, it's that individual's responsibility to make sure that they're going to be able to meet the requirements, the immigration requirements, and any other requirements for going into that country. Obviously, as employers and responsible employers, you will want to ensure that they are fully compliant with the rules. So it's very important, going back to that education piece, to make sure that you do educate your employees on what the limitations are under the visitor category, when it's likely that they might potentially need a work authorization, and to look at that whole myriad of other issues as well, from the regulatory issues through to the tax issues and so forth. So whilst responsibility rests with the employees, obviously, as a responsible employer, I think you will want to undertake that due diligence prior to their travel.
It's a really interesting question, and I think a big headache for HR in particular, in terms of, you know, not only do you have the calculator, but you have some privacy issues there as well, as asking people where they've gone on their holidays who may not want you to know. So, so there we go. I think there was a question over there as well.
Yeah, it was just about what resource would you use to check your sort of entry requirements? Is it the government website, the UK government website, and then you just put in travel to wherever you're going, and then it will tell you about what the work implications are?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there are lots of resources out there. The web is very wide with resources in relation to travel. I think it's important that you do obtain your guidance from a credible source. It's all too easy to log on to a website and to get inaccurate data, which, whilst you could refer to that if you are speaking to an immigration officer, they're ultimately going to say it's your responsibility to understand what those rules are. It's your personal responsibility. So do go to a credible source. Yes, government websites should it provide the bottom line in relation to that, but there are nuances in relation to that which you really probably need to be navigated around. And so I think it is helpful to have some professional advice in relation to that, whether that be from a lawyer or whether it be from a travel provider where they can give you some guidance.
I was just going to put in a pitch for us there, to go to your TMC and ask those questions and allow them to guide you. Any other questions? One from Ellen.
Hi, thank you so much. Just to come back on the subject that we discussed earlier with Andrew. I know some of the Caribbean is a bit generous, sorry, but some of the Caribbean islands and Dubai have now set up a remote working visa. Do you foresee more countries doing this?
Yeah.
And do you know which one?
Yeah, digital nomads is the big sort of word in relation to remote working at the moment. First I heard that term, I thought, what on earth did that mean? But yes, we did see a lot of the Caribbean countries, when tourism was totally cut off, introducing visas whereby you could go and work remotely from there. And whilst that's great, obviously there's a limit to the number of people you can send to the Caribbean. The advantage of some of those schemes were that they also took into account the tax requirements, which was brilliant. Now, we have seen a few other countries introduce digital nomad type visas, but they're in isolation of the tax rules. So you can obtain a visa to go and work remotely from that jurisdiction, but you're still subject to the tax rules. And I think that's the difficulty. You can't look at these things in isolation and you certainly can't just look at it from an immigration perspective. You do need to take into account the tax rules. So we have seen, I think recently, one for Greece being introduced, and also sort of visas in some Asia-Pacific countries as well. So it's a changing picture, and as I said, it's quite a dynamic picture. A lot of countries are developing these in response to this sort of new world that we see now before us. So I think we'll see a lot more of them. But at the moment, the main ones have been in the Caribbean. There are quite a few obscure ones as well, which are interesting. I think there's one in sort of this sort of northern part of Norway, where you can go and work in a particular territory in Norway, in the middle of nowhere, and on that basis. But most people, I think, would prefer the Caribbean, to be honest.
I would definitely prefer the Caribbean, given the choice. Any other questions?
Yeah, so I just had one, a bit more touching on the visa requirements. So we have a lot of presence in EMEA and UK, and employees going between the two for training opportunities. And what we like to offer people is if they wanted to stay for a weekend or an extra week and cover their own accommodation and fly back to explore. Is that kind of permitted under the visa rule, where you say what you're going for your business purpose, but then staying a bit more for leisure? Is there kind of a way they can do that on their form, or is that something we need to be a bit more cautious of?
It depends on the jurisdiction you're going to. The UK rules are quite wide, so you can come in for your primary intention, which may be a business meeting, and then you can undertake leisure either side of that. Or you could come in for a leisure trip and potentially do a bit of remote working whilst you're here. It's a grey area, though, as I mentioned before, as to when that then becomes a breach of the visitor rules. So you do need to be quite cautious in relation to that. But ultimately, it's going to depend upon the rules in the particular country where you're going to. And some countries are a lot more strict and restrictive in relation to this than others. So I think you do need to take a cautious approach to that. And I think just going back to what Helene was saying in relation to this, these requests can take up an awful lot of time in terms of just assessing whether or not someone has work authorization, what the tax implications are, and so forth. So perhaps as businesses where you have people traveling a lot, you might want to just take a look at more broadly at things and look at your overall strategy in relation to that, and whether you think it's a worthwhile investment in your people to provide that type of specific planning for one-off trips, or whether you take a broader brush approach to this. And a lot of companies have done that. They've placed a total restriction on those types of arrangements. Others are much more flexible.